Today on The State of Us, the uncertain future of the workforce. Organizations must contend with rising uncertainty about the long-term impacts of remote work on productivity and profitability, and an economy that's teetering precariously between inflation and recession, as well as an ongoing labor shortage. Wow, it sounds like it's a tricky time to be in business. Welcome to The State of Us. I'm your host, Justin T. Weller, joined today by the one and only, your friendly redneck liberal and the senior resident historian here at True Chat, Mr. Lance Jackson.
Great report on every page. I don't know how we're going to get it all in, so we're going to trust. We're going to trust Robin to lead us through this, because I've got 4 or 5 things underlined on each page of the report. So it's some fascinating reading, and suffice to say that it doesn't seem like many of today's business leaders are looking at the numbers, or if they are, they're going ahead and doing what they want anyway.
So they might be looking at them, but they're not necessarily
following what the data says.
Okay, right. They don't like the results.
But we'll get into that. We'll get into that with the expert here in a minute.
So, Lance, spoiler alert, Robin Erickson, PhD, is Vice President of Human Capital at the Conference Board and leads the development of research insights across all functions of human capital. We've been speaking with her for several years on The State of Us, even all the way back when she was just the lowly principal researcher in human capital, where she conducted industry surveys and researched leading practices. She has written now over 70 reports and has hosted or been featured across media, radio, podcasts, and TV. Robin, thank you for joining us yet again.
Thank you so much, Justin and Lance. It is my pleasure to hang out with you guys for a while.
We're still slogging along, and you're just doing more and more. Something's not, we're not following your lead. Your intro, you're doing more and more stuff, and we're still doing the same thing.
Hey, I'm quite sure the number of podcasts that you guys have hosted has gone up since the last time we chatted. So,
well, I'm going to jump right. I'm going to jump right in.
It keeps climbing.
Well, there is something about just going to work every day, I guess.
We keep showing up, and the numbers just keep going.
There you go. See,
it just starts out. There are 3 main points here, and I'm going to let you kind of lead and talk us through these. But the first thing is, it's really interesting. It says here, the survey found that you all did that 68% of responding organizations are considering or implementing strategies to increase on-site work, while 73% of respondents report difficulty enticing workers back to the office. Sounds like we're having a head-on collision here.
We certainly do. And in fact, we talk in this reimagined workplace, the title is Striking a Delicate Balance, because there are competing objectives between employees who are looking for more flexibility and employers who really want to bring their workers back to the office.
So, and it says here, number 2 is getting workers to return to the office. The number 1 problem is finding qualified workers. So if my biggest problem is finding qualified workers, but most workers want to work remote or hybrid, but I'm forcing am I not, what am I missing? Or am I understanding this? Or am I not missing anything?
You're not missing anything. So, yes.
I'm reading these numbers correctly, right?
You are
because I'm flabbergasted. It's like, this is all laid out. And then every major newspaper I pick up, or, if I'm watching, CNBC or whatever, every CEO is talking about, we've got to get our people back into work. We got to get our people back into the buildings, blah, 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 blah. And I'm like, but this report I'm reading says all of your arguments don't hold water. And we got the information from you.
Well, because that's the leading thing, right? It feels like we've been talking about this a long time, but in fact, even before COVID, we had, I think it was just a few months before the pandemic, we had a conversation with Robin, I think, about the looming labor shortage. I think that's even what if people want to go back and listen, I think the title is something along those lines. So we had this problem, we had this looming issue of a labor shortage already. You have a pandemic, and the nature of how most white collar jobs are being conducted is changing, and people decide, hey, we like this. The higher ups in organizations seem to be saying, the main argument is concerns about productivity. But I mean, what I'm seeing in the report, Robin, and I guess tell me if I'm wrong, is that according to the Bureau of Labor Statistics, so not the Conference Board's research, but the government's research indicates that remote work's not likely to blame for any productivity issues.
So we actually said may not be to blame, but we did actually plot the U.S. Labor Productivity Index from 2019 until the first quarter of 2023 against the percentage of remote workers. And what you find when you do that is that we all know there weren't as many remote workers back in 2019. That number increased significantly when COVID hit and we had all the lockdowns and all the workers who could worked from home. And so at that point, productivity actually increased from where it was. So 2020 productivity increased from where it was in 2019, along with that big increase in remote work. And then when you get to 2021, something interesting happens. Productivity increases even farther than it had. So on the U.S. Labor Productivity Index, it went up even farther than it had the year before. But remote work had started to come down because if you remember, we had vaccines in the hands of the general public by the beginning winter of 2021. So the workers could go back to the office. So, 3 years does not a trend make. We realize that. But there are a lot of reports out there. In fact, I just saw one that came out recently based on the Bureau of Labor Statistics time use survey, saying that people working in the office are more productive. They work 2.5 hours more every week. But if you think about all of those hours, they may not be as productive. So I think you have to look at both, right? Where people are working and how productive they are.
The term that comes in, and I'm pulling this from the 60s and 70s, but is this a generational gap thing? Do we have the older generation that are the CEOs and then the younger generations that are like, well, I don't have to be in the office to get my job done. Why do you have to see me? I mean, is this like the old generation gap that I grew up with when I was a teenager and you can't trust anybody over the age of 30? I mean, is it just the way that two different age groups, which by the way is probably still true, even though I'm over the age of 30, I'd probably still feel that way I feel that way and I'm 62. I still can't trust anybody over 30. Probably why I spent my entire lifetime working with young people, because they'll give you honest answers. But is this like a generational gap thing? I mean, are the older people that are the CEOs just stuck in their ways and the younger workers are like, well, you've given me, I've got all this technology now that was never available before, and I can do and turn out volumes of work, and I don't have to be there rubbing elbows and drinking coffee in an office. And, I don't even want to drink coffee anymore because I go to Starbucks and drink a latte and work while I'm sitting there in these comfy chairs. Why do I have to sit at a desk, with a rolling chair on a plastic mat? I mean, is it a generational gap thing, or is there really something too that we would be better off if everybody went to work? I mean, what are the numbers saying?
So I'm going to equivocate slightly and say that part of this is a generational gap. It's not the whole thing. If you think about Gen Z, they were all born in 1997 or later. So the youngest of them is just 26 and a half who's working today. They actually went to school, many of them finished their schooling during lockdowns. And so they are very comfortable with technology, as you were just mentioning. And they also know how to collaborate. They also know how to, they're more comfortable, actually, many times being remote, texting each other rather than having meetings, talking in person. So there is a slight generation gap there. But we've also found that the other generations are very interested in the increased flexibility that comes from being able to work remotely.
Okay.
If you think about it, we all had to adapt really quickly back when the lockdowns happened. Mm-hmm. But a lot of people have found out that now they can take their kids to school or pick them up after school or, walk the dog during lunch. A lot of that flexibility is very desirable to other generations, not just the youngest generation. And there's also the argument that just being remote actually does hinder you from getting to know your colleagues as well. It's harder to start a job. So for onboarding and all of that. So one of the suggestions that we're making is that organizations should consider requiring their employees to come back to the office for specific things. So to treat their office like in the past, we used to have offsites. Treat coming into the office like an offsite, because there's nothing worse than going into the office and finding out you have to sit in a closet all day to take Zoom calls.
So, Robin, I mean, as I'm looking through stuff, one of the things that stood out is you all asked a question in the Reimagine Workplace survey, and the question was, in general, how difficult is it for your organization to do the following? And the responses were the percentage of those responding very difficult or somewhat difficult. And the second highest thing was get workers to return to the office, with 73% of respondents saying it was very difficult or somewhat difficult to get workers to return to the office. Obviously, that's something that organizations are making a priority. We talked about the whole correlation causation thing, because I mean, Lance would tell you I'm always on that on the show, as you know, just because there's a correlation does not necessarily mean that one is causing the other. But I mean, there is other evidence to tell us that remote work doesn't necessarily negatively impact productivity and may actually help it, because there's a 2023 study, right, by Stanford University that found that remote workers are 13% more productive than their in-office counterparts, and that they're actually less likely to take sick days and more likely to be satisfied with their jobs.
Yeah.
So,
and we actually found in our most recent job satisfaction report that hybrid workers were the most satisfied. They were more satisfied than those workers who were only remote and those workers who were only on site. So the sweet
spot was trying to, like you said, I mean, or at least it seems, right, in some ways, is to strike that balance of there are definitely things that can benefit from that in-person opportunity that we as humans need for certain things. But there's also benefits to be drawn from giving that flexibility, which seems to be something that all of the generations are interested in as well. And so that maybe the answer for organizations is to try, like you said, to figure out that bridge. Is that right?
Definitely agree. I think that hybrid is the best solution, at least for right now. And we actually found, because when you have statistics, you can play with them. We did what we call cross-tabbing. And we looked at that question about how difficult it was for an organization to retain workers by whether or not their on-site work policy was mandated, strongly encouraged, the employee choice, or there was no policy. And we found that those organizations that mandated their on-site work policy were 71% of the organizations found it difficult to retain workers. Compared to if it was employee choice, only 46% of the organizations had difficulty retaining workers. So that's a 25 percentage point difference, or a 50% difference. So organizations that are struggling to attract and retain talent, the more flexible that they can be in their on-site work policies, the better off they'll be.
So there's all this continued conversation, obviously, about, you know, inflation and what the Fed's doing and rates and how this is impacting the economy. And the economy is, by most measures, beginning to slow, yet organizations are continuing to have serious difficulties finding and retaining workers. Let's talk about hybrid work may be part of that, but what else could be contributing? Keep it here on The State of Us. We'll be right back. The U.S. economy has been slowing for a year, which would typically lead to high unemployment and fewer new jobs. That's according to a recent report by the Conference Board. Robin Erickson, who is the Vice President of Human Capital at the Conference Board, is joining us today to help us break down what this new report tells us. And the report goes on to say that even though you would expect high unemployment and fewer new jobs. According to a June 2023 analysis, the strong U.S. labor market continues to defy expectations. Unemployment has risen only slightly, and thousands of new jobs continue to be created each month. In the survey, the Conference Board discovered that 88% of organizations employing mostly manual service workers report difficulty finding qualified individuals, as do 75% of those employing mostly office workers. So, I mean, on the low end, you've got 3/4 of employers finding it difficult to find qualified individuals.
Yes. So this goes back to what you mentioned on the previous segment around the fact that we've had labor market challenges for a while. In fact, we actually have a labor market shortage, and been more acute in the manual services sector than it has been in the professional and office workers sector. But during the Great Resignation, which started winter of 2021 and probably ebbed last summer when reports of the slowing economy started, there's actually, just as an aside, there's some talk that the Great Resignation may come back. But so what happened during the Great Resignation was that we didn't just have a shortage of manual services workers. We actually had a shortage also of professional and office workers, because basically employees were voting with their feet. If they didn't like the flexibility that was being required by their organizations, they voted with their feet. They went someplace else. And that's what employees do when they feel like it's safe. So what I mean by that? Well, I've been doing research on looking at unemployment in the U.S. against voluntary turnover for over 15 years. And when unemployment is low, which is what we've had for a very long time now, voluntary turnover is high. So even with the slowing economy, typically in a slowing economy, we would have what we call a jobless economy. But we've had a job full economy because the labor market has remained very strong. And so, yes, we are finding that on the low end, 75% of all organizations are having difficulties finding workers. They're also having difficulties retaining workers. And you can see that just by the number of signs that are up in organizational windows, the fact that you sometimes can't get a table someplace because they don't have enough workers that night. So I do think that we are going to have this for a while. There's no signs of it ebbing. And, you asked earlier, Justin, about what else could be causing the labor shortages. It's not just the on-site work policy. We also have challenges because immigration has slowed. We also have a lot more Americans going to college these days. And so that means that there's fewer workers in sort of the hourly category. So those are just a couple things. But we did find that hybrid work was very appealing to different types of workers.
It sounds to me like what I was feeling before COVID when we talked about the looming, labor crisis, is that this isn't like, this could be really bad. It's already not real good. But it seems like this could be a serious problem, and that there's not necessarily a lot of perfectly clean-cut answers, and that not a lot of organizations are very aggressively attacking this problem or pushing the governmental side of things to attack this problem either. And the longer we wait, the better chance it is that the worse this is when it all comes to a head. I mean, I don't know. I don't want to sound
right. Doomsday,
crazy alarmist. I mean, I don't know what comes of all of this if the worst comes to pass. But it does. What I don't hear in here is any simple, like, oh, well, if we just do this, it'll be fixed. Because it's like, well, no, because okay, we could, for example, we could do.
But is there something to be fixed? I mean, it's power to the worker, right? I mean, you have a struggle. You have a struggle between
yes
the workers.
no.
I mean, we have, the UAWs getting ready to maybe go on strike. We've had a writer's strike in Hollywood, right?
You've been excited.
For 100 days. But we're also having big corporations having huge layoffs. And, that's all addressed in here as well. And I want to hear what Robin has to say. And my other question is, if I am a leader of one of these organizations and I want my people to come back in, how do I get them in? I just find it interesting too. And you address it in your report, in this time of layoffs, people are still having a hard time finding workers. So on one hand, I guess it's almost like, what industry are you in? And then UPS just signed a big contract, right? With a lot of pay increases and stuff. So, I mean, it just kind of seems like it depends on what field of work you're in, how you're affected by this, or am I way off base?
No, you're exactly right. So in our report, we did ask organizations about cost-cutting measures that they may have implemented in the last 6 months or that they were planning to implement in the next 6 months. And layoffs are always interesting because, yes, we have heard about, especially in some of the tech companies that said that they overhired during the pandemic, they've been doing layoffs. And so the industries where layoffs were the most prevalent in the last 6 months were information services, publishing and telecommunications, that's grouped together for us, healthcare and pharmaceutical, and manufacturing. And organizations are expecting to continue layoffs. One of the things that I've written about here at the conference board is that there are alternatives to layoffs because oftentimes layoffs don't help the profitability of an organization much beyond a quarter or two.
That's what I found very interesting. I'm glad that's what I was hinting at. I'm glad can you go into that a little bit? Because it was like, well, I'm, in charge. I'm going to lay off people because that's going to make us look good. And your numbers you found out that really doesn't work, right?
Well, it can work. It might work for the next, quarter of earnings. But what happens when you lay people off is that your voluntary turnover increases because your employee morale decreases.
Oh, you mean the other people who kept their jobs start worrying about whether or not they're going to be next and they start
and
looking for somewhere else to work?
They're worried about their colleagues who are friends. We actually call them in the business downsizing survivors. But yeah, so they have a lower morale. From that lower morale, they will actually have a higher voluntary turnover. You also have a loss of skills, learning, productivity, innovation, and brand reputational risks, because who wants to go work for a company that regularly does layoffs? You'll keep looking if you have an option. So I think it's really important for organizations to think, especially with the labor shortage, that perhaps layoffs may not be the best lever to pull, and to think about some of the other levers that they may be able to pull. Which
would be what? What are some other things that I can do to avoid layoffs, but also cut my costs so it looks good to my shareholders?
Sure. Well, you can reduce travel. You can reduce hiring. You can reduce or delay your compensation, increases, bonuses, that sort of thing. You can also ask your employees. Earlier, you said, how do you find out what employees want? What's most important?
Yeah.
Ask them. The technology exists to do employee experience or employee engagement surveys. We even now have the technology, thanks to ChatGPT and the other generative AI tools, to remember on those employee engagement surveys, there was always this place where you could fill in the blank, tell us the one thing that would make your job better. And people would write things in, and it was such a pain in the neck because you had to code them individually, whatever those responses were. Well, you can put all of that information now into ChatGPT and, ask it for the top 5 themes, and it'll come out, in less than a minute. So, in fact,
the beauty of artificial intelligence.
Well, and that's the other thing that I think is going to help our labor shortage. I think that innovation in and new types of AI. I'm not trying to say that the robots are coming and going to take our jobs, but if you think about it, the advent of electricity. I'm sure the candle makers, were wringing their hands, right? They weren't going to be able to sell as many candles, but none of us would want to go back to a time without electricity. So there will be new and different jobs as a result of innovation and further advances in AI.
So one thing, and we're going to have to continue this after the break, but I want our listeners to be thinking about this. So we've talked about all this different stuff, right? Hybrid work and what could be done to convince workers to come back if they need to be back. What can relate to low morale, and how all of this plays into this notion of a labor shortage. Isn't there still this fundamental factual issue? And this is what I want to hear Robin's thoughts on, of the number of unemployed individuals looking for jobs versus the number of available jobs. There are less people looking for jobs than the total number of jobs that we're trying to fill. Isn't there a simple math issue here with, we can do all this beautiful stuff that we've talked about today, all these things but that doesn't change. Does that change? Maybe it does change. I don't understand how it manufactures more people, but maybe Robin can help us understand that. Keep it here on The State of Us, and we'll be right back. We've been talking with Robin Erickson, the Vice President of Human Capital at the Conference Board. She's been sharing some tremendous insights today from the research recently conducted and completed by the Conference Board in their Reimagined Workplace survey. And what I had brought up before the end of the show is just this fundamental notion, and Lance and I have talked about this, I think, twice this year. There are more jobs available than there are people interested in filling jobs. That's a problem, because obviously it's not a one-for-one anyway, which we've talked about. It's not like, oh, well, we got these 10 million people, so we just hire all them, and then there's only 2 million that we haven't, it doesn't work that way, obviously, because not everybody looking for a job can be plugged into the jobs that are open. Does any of this stuff make more workers appear? Because even if we do a better job of retaining workers, even if we do a better job of decreasing turnover, that doesn't fix this fundamental, huge roadblock in front of our economy, it would seem like.
Unless we can figure out how to do more work with automation, artificial intelligence, or this might be a different show, people start having more babies.
Well, isn't there, and I'm going to speak, I think I'm the only retiree on the show. I would like to go back to work, but there are a lot of government regulations that it really doesn't benefit me very much to go to work. So is it another, and I know this isn't your area of expertise. I don't think. If it is, please tell me. But for me, let me get a hold of some of my IRA money that I put away, and don't tax me so highly, because I'm also collecting, my retirement benefits. But I'd love to go back to work, but I'm going to work for pennies on the dollar if I go back to work. So there's no incentive.
Well, because a fact point that you and I have brought up a lot of times before, right, is folks understanding that the unemployment numbers don't capture people who have given up.
Right. There's only 10 million people that are looking for work, but there may be another 30 million of us who would like to work, but it's not advantageous for us to work. So why should we?
Because not only does the unemployment number not capture, for example, somebody like Lance, who just isn't looking for a job because they've left the workforce, right, who have retired, so to speak, which everybody could think about, okay, well, that makes sense, right? Obviously, we wouldn't count them in there. It's also counting the people of traditional working age jobs. That's a problem, because obviously it's not a one-for-one anyway, which we've talked about. It's not like, oh, well, we got these 10 million people, so we just hire all them, and then there's only 2 million that we haven't, it doesn't work that way, obviously, because not everybody looking for a job can be plugged into the jobs that are open. Does any of this stuff make more workers appear? Because even if we do a better job of retaining workers, even if we do a better job of decreasing turnover, that doesn't fix this fundamental, huge roadblock in front of our economy, it would seem like.
Unless we can figure out how to do more work with automation, artificial intelligence, or this might be a different show, people start having more babies.
Well, isn't there, and I'm going to speak, I think I'm the only retiree on the show. I would like to go back to work, but there are a lot of government regulations that it really doesn't benefit me very much to go to work. So is it another, and I know this isn't your area of expertise. I don't think. If it is, please tell me. But for me, let me get a hold of some of my IRA money that I put away and don't tax me so highly, because I'm also collecting, my retirement benefits. I'd love to go back to work, but I'm going to work for pennies on the dollar if I go back to work. So there's no incentive.
Well, because a fact point that you and I have brought up a lot of times before, right, is folks understanding that the unemployment numbers don't capture people who have given up.
Right. There's only 10 million people that are looking for work, but there may be another 30 million of us who would like to work, but it's not advantageous for us to work. So why should we?
Because not only does the unemployment number not capture, for example, somebody like Lance, who just isn't looking for a job because they've left the workforce, right, who have like retired, so to speak, which everybody could think about, okay, well, that makes sense, right? Obviously, we wouldn't count them in there. It's also counting the people of traditional working age who are not working, who are not
actively looking for
work.
Or they have been looking and they've given up. And I think I'm sure many of your listeners are saying, hey, I wasn't able to find a job. And so I think there's a few things that we have to look at. I think we have to look at, you had mentioned earlier, if we have 10 million people who are looking for work and 12 million open positions, there's not a one-to-one. So we do need to be looking at how can we, in cost-effective ways, reskill those workers who may not have the skills that are currently being looked for. I think with more remote work, location will not matter as much. And so I think that could also be helpful to those people who aren't working, who want to be. I also think we have to be looking at, like you were saying, Lance, how do we make it possible for retired workers to come back to the office? How do we make it flexible enough? Because chances are really good if somebody's already retired, they don't want to work 60 hours a week. They might only want to work 20 hours a week, or they might only want to work in the summertime because they want to golf in Florida in the summer, in the winter. So I think,
and yet they have that expertise and the skill that the company's looking for.
Correct.
So there ought to be some way to mesh those, right?
No, and oftentimes what organizations do when someone retires is they bring them back as a contractor and pay them more. So I think that organizations have to figure out different models of work, like more part-time jobs, allowing workers more flexibility in terms of the hours that they work. One of my favorite stories is how Walmart created a scheduling app that allows their workers to have some more flexibility. They can pick their shifts. They can, on a 10-year basis, they can swap shifts. They can look for additional ones. And the technology exists. It's just really making sure that organizations are leveraging it.
Is there anything else that you gleaned from doing this report that you want to share with us and with our listeners before we wrap things up? Anything that we've missed so far?
So I would also just like to mention how prevalent side hustles are becoming, or independent gigs. I think there are a lot of workers who, especially during the beginning of the pandemic, when so many people were laid off here in the US and other countries, they figured out how they could make money, right? They could make money by selling recipes. Who would have ever thought that somebody could stay home, write recipes, and make money from that? But there's also the the Uber and the Lyft, right? Those were some of the first sort of side hustles that people did and turned them into full-time positions. But the beauty of those is that you do the work when you want to. And so I just would encourage organizations to think about how can you provide more flexibility for your employees in terms of schedules, in terms of workplace, to feed all of these different desires, because now technology exists that we can do all of those things.
Because even if you were like manual labor, and I'm thinking I've loaded semis before, right out of in a warehouse. I mean, you could know when you were going to have a bunch of trucks that needed to be loaded or whatever. So couldn't you just hire some people who wanted to work part-time who come in and drive the forklift and load the semis on Tuesday and Thursday to hit the road? I mean, it seems like, and your point of, with all of the technology we have to set things up, that should be something that's pretty easy across the board, not just necessarily for office workers, but for manual laborers as well. When your peak times are. I mean, I remember being in high school and working in the fast food industry, right? You either worked 11 to 2 or you worked 5 days. You either work, we call it the lunch rush or the dinner rush. And I noticed here too, you also have, split shifts. There were those of us that would come in and work from, 11 to 2, and then we'd have the afternoon off and they'd bring us in and work, 5 to 8, because the restaurant knew that's when they were going to be the busiest. I mean, you don't necessarily have to reinvent the wheel, right? We have some things here that have worked in the past that we could implement today.
So I'll give you one example because I know time is short, but we've written about this. Marriott International, we're all familiar with the hotel chain. Well, they have developed an in-house gig worker model. What does that mean? Well, they were looking for housekeepers in a major city here in the US, and somebody had the bright idea that said, why don't we run an advertisement that said you can work whatever hours you want and see if anybody signs up. Well, they had housekeepers coming out of the woodwork, people who never had done housekeeping before, but they wanted to supplement their income. They were interested in hospitality, and the gig workers, they would share their availability. And then when hotels didn't have enough coverage, there was the technology to match the gig workers with the hotels that needed housekeeping. So the technology exists. I think we just have to get smarter about using it.
So, Robin, last thing, because we do have to wrap up. You're looking at this information all the time, and I had shared in the second segment, kind of that concern about where all this could be headed. Are you optimistic, pessimistic, cautiously one of those two about our country as a whole addressing this, or is it going to have to get worse before it gets better?
So I've been looking at employees for the last 20 years, studying them. It's been the topic of my passion, right? Both acquiring them and retaining them. So I do think that during periods of recession, organizations have treated employees like they're lucky to have a job. I do think that during the pandemic, organizations realized that if they weren't really concerned about their workers, they could lose them. So they had to implement remote work. They had to implement safety procedures, all of those things that